Okay, let's go over Chapter 4 Study Guide. The colonies in North America were established for religious and economic reasons. And I can remember this because it's actually pretty humorous. In the North, the colonies were based on religion. And in the South, it was economic, which you would think is the opposite because the South today is much more religious than the North, and the North is very powerful economically. So things have changed over the past couple hundred years, but when they first got started here in America, the religious colonies were in the north. And we'll go over that and I'll show you later in this presentation. But first, let's review some terms that we should know. This is from Chapter 2, actually, natural resources, things that come from nature. Human resources, people working to produce goods and services. Capital resources, goods produced and used to make other goods and services. We already know that, but this will have to do with what we're going to be doing in the colonies now. The other two terms that we really should remember are specialization, interdependence. Specialization is a focus on producing one or a few products. So if you produce leather, you have cows and you make leather, that is your specialization. You focus on making leather. Or if you make baseball gloves, then you just take that leather and make baseball gloves, and that's what you do, and you're really good at it. It's called specialization. If you weren't specialized, you would maybe make baseball gloves, and then you would make other toys. Um, I don't know, fishing rods. You do a bunch of things. But if you specialize, then you just focus on one thing like baseball gloves. Interdependence, two or more people depending on others. And follow that example. Let's say you are a leather maker, then you rely on somebody making something with your leather, like a baseball glove. And the person making a baseball glove relies on somebody producing that leather so that they can use it to make the baseball glove. So if there's no leather, then the person making the baseball glove is out of luck. They're not going to be able to produce anything. So they're dependent on that leather maker. And vice versa. Leather maker needs somebody to make things from their leather, otherwise the leather is useless. So they're really interdependent. All right. A couple other things that we should remember. Um, Economic relationship with Great Britain. The colonies had their trade strictly controlled by Great Britain. Great Britain taxed the colonies after the French and Indian War that we saw at the end of the chapter. French and Indian War cost the Great Britain lots of money, so they started taxing the colonies, which is going to be basically our whole next chapter when we get to it. The colonies traded raw materials for goods made in Britain, so basically the colonies would make these raw materials. They would send it to Great Britain, and Great Britain would turn it into something more valuable and sell it back. So back to our example, let's say they made leather which is a raw material. They got leather and sent it to England. England made baseball gloves and then sold it back to the colonies. So the industry was in Great Britain and the raw materials were coming from the colonies. Okay, the political relationship with Great Britain. Colonists had to obey British laws which were enforced by the governors. Colonial governors were appointed by the king or by the proprietor, and a colonial legislature made laws for each colony but was monitored by the colonial governor. We learned this in class where the governors were appointed by the king and the legislature was in two groups, the governor's council, which was appointed by the governor, and then the legislature, or excuse me, the assembly was voted in by the voters. The legislature would make the law. That's where we get legislate. Legislature legislates the laws. They write them. And then they send it to the governor, and the governor can approve it or not approve it. And if he doesn't approve it, it's not law. If he does approve it, it is law. But then he is responsible to enforce those laws once they are laws. So that is how the British set up their colonial governments. So let's get to the colonies themselves. We'll start with the two regions that are in the north. We have the New England colonies, and you can see them here: New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and they're up here in this part of the colonies. Now, Remember, in the north, anything above this line here is going to be religious. So when we're talking about the New England colonies, they were um, they were made because they wanted to avoid religious persecution. The people that it consisted of were the separatists, which we know as the Pilgrims. They were landed right here in Plymouth. And then we have the Puritans, who landed in Massachusetts Bay, which turns into Boston. Up here, you have the Appalachian Mountains, good harbors, but it's rocky terrain, jagged coastline, and it was colder. Okay, they had moderate summers and cold winters. Now, when you have rocky terrain and colder temperatures, you're not going to be able to farm very much. So they had to rely on the water. And in class, we talked about, let's think about water when we talk about New England colonies. Um, their resources were timber, fish, and deep harbors. They were skilled craftsmen, fishermen, merchants, shipbuilders. They built ships. They made things. They made tools, built buildings. So things that have to do, go fishing, making ships. Remember, the water is what they're going to be about. Since they're very religious, they would have village, school, and church were the center of life. Spent a lot of time in church, and there were religious reformers, which is why they didn't want them in England. They didn't like, they wanted them to do whatever the religion was in England. These people wouldn't comply, so they had to leave and come here. When it came to making laws and rules, they would have town meetings. And to reiterate, they specialized in fishing, shipbuilding, naval supplies, metal tools, and equipment. Uh, and here we have interdependence. New England would depend on the southern colonies for crops such as tobacco, and they would get their food from the mid-Atlantic, and they would send these things to those two other places. All right, let's take a look at the mid-Atlantic colonies. So the mid-Atlantic colonies are right over here in the middle. You got New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware. It's New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. Since they're in the middle, they have the benefits really of both the other two regions. The main one that we're going to talk about is Pennsylvania. That was settled by the Quakers who wanted freedom to practice their faith without interference. So they're also about religion. See, anything above this line here, we're talking about religion. And anytime we go to the southern part of each of these, the north or the south, we're going to add the word freedom. So we got religion, religious freedom. Okay? Appalachian Mountains, we're going to see this again and again. This is one thing that goes through all three regions. Coastal plains, harbors, rivers, rich farmland, moderate climate, very good for growing crops. Natural resources, rich farmland, and rivers, like Hudson River, Delaware River over here, will go right into major cities like New York and Philadelphia and make them help them become much bigger cities. They would also make tools and buildings. In fact, we'll see that pretty much everywhere. They had villages and cities. They were very diverse because the Quakers believed, they really did believe in religious freedom, that they accepted all faiths. They felt that everybody should be respected. So when word got out that you can go to this place, that if you have a religion or you're not accepted by the people around you, you can go here and they'll treat you at least a little bit better, if not equally. In fact, William Penn, who founded Pennsylvania, believed that all people should be treated fairly. He treated the Indians fairly. He wanted to give equal rights to women, and today we take that for granted, but back then it was pretty radical. When they made rules of diverse cultural backgrounds, diverse religions, obviously, political life and civic life, they made their rules and laws in market towns. So if we look up here, town meeting, market town. They specialized in food, livestock, grains, fish. So they produced a lot of food. So they'd send this food to New England, and they would get the products that they made in New England, and then they would get the cash crops from the South. And they would get metal tools and equipment from New England. And then we get the southern colonies. So now we're in the south. We're going to have two different things going on here. So as we go south, we got Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, right over here. So we have a couple colonies that we should remember. We have the Roanoke Island Colony that was established as an economic venture, as was Jamestown. Roanoke Island somewhere over here, and then Jamestown over here. And they're both economic ventures. Georgia was a little bit different. Georgia was for economic freedom, and the reason why we say that is because the people that came there were in debtor's prison. They owed people money, and in order to get out of jail, they agreed to come over as indentured servants and work here so they can get out of jail. As we see here, Appalachian Mountains again, as we saw in all the other regions, Atlantic coastal plain, harbors, rivers, fertile farmland, humid climate. It's hot and humid down there. If you've ever been down there, it's warmer than it is right here in Bluefield. Uh, the natural resources, fertile farmland, rivers, harbors, forests. Uh, they were farmers, enslaved African Americans, indentured servants there, and tools and buildings again. Um, but people lived on plantations, mansions, few cities. Everybody was spread out because you had all these plantations, and few schools. The Church of England was the dominant religion down there. Like the Puritans were dominant up here, Church of England, because uh, they didn't take their religion as seriously as they did in the northern regions. So they just went along with whatever was going on in England. That was the Church of England. So instead of going into town meetings or market towns, they organized in counties, and that's easy to remember because we're Tazewell County and we're in the south. So you could just remember that, Tazewell County, and they organized themselves in the south as counties. They produced tobacco, rice, indigo, forest products, lumber, tar, pitch, mostly um, tobacco, indigo here, and then later cotton. And we call those cash crops. And it's easy to remember because economics was the big thing. We have economic venture, economic freedom, cash crops, all flows together. So that's easy to remember. And the South would send their cash crops to get manufactured goods from New England and food from the Mid-Atlantic. And finally, on this last page here, which is really, really good to help you remember all the different people that lived in the colonies. Large landowners, mostly in the South, relied on indentured servants and enslaved African Americans for labor, were educated in some cases, and had a rich social culture. Lots of parties, dances, and so forth, as you can see by his picture here. She's all dressed up and ready to go someplace important, someplace fun. And farmers worked the land according to the region. So if you're in the north, you probably grew food, and if you're in the south, you probably grew cash crops. They relied on family members for labor. That meant the women and the children all helped out on the farm. And then we come to artisans. These are craftsmen that use tools to create something. They worked in towns and on plantations and cities, lived in small villages and cities. And then we have merchants. These are the people that buy and sell goods to the colonies. Without them, you would have to go to each individual farm or workshop or whatever. But merchants made it very convenient to go to one place and get different things. You know, think about it like a old-timey Walmart. And then they lived in towns and cities as well. Women worked as caretakers, houseworkers, and homemakers. They were not allowed to vote and had few opportunities for getting education. They could not own land. They could not, um, their life really wasn't their own. Uh, they had to follow what was going on with the family. Free African Americans also were not allowed to vote, just like women, but they were able to own land. This thing. And they had economic freedom. They could work for pay and decide how their money was spent. So that's the difference there between them and women. The similarities are they could not, both groups could not vote. Then we get to indentured servants. These are people that were very poor back in Europe, but agreed to come over to the colonies as indentured servants, as servants for 5 to 7 years usually, in return for uh, the person that they are hiring them uh, to get a ship across. They get passage, they get a ticket across to the New World, and in return they would work for them for several years. And at the end, they were free to leave. Enslaved African Americans were similar in the sense of the work that they did. Um, it would be difficult to um, see the difference between what they were doing. They had very similar jobs, but the differences, the main differences, is that the enslaved African Americans, the differences are in the beginning and the end. Slave African Americans did not choose to go and be slaves, whereas indentured servants did. And then at the end, the indentured servants were allowed to be freed, and the slaves were not. And it got so bad, even the children of enslaved African Americans were often born into slavery once the laws were changed. They were owned as property for life and did not have any rights. All right, so let me go back and let you pause for each thing. I'll center it here. Okay, so you could pause that and study it if you need to. And then we got the New England. Mid-Atlantic, you can pause it there if you want to study that. Southern, you can pause it there. And that one. All right, study, study, study. Good luck.